How's it going, Eliminators? Today, we're going to be working on a Craftsman snowblower that my customer said won't start, and it's a perfect follow-up to last week's video. So with that being said, let's get right into it. So in the shop today, I have this Craftsman snowblower that came in. Again, my customer said it just wouldn't start. And like I said in the intro, this is a pretty cool follow-up to last week's video. If you haven't seen that one, we worked on a Craftsman snowblower that had a lot of play in the idler arm shaft that ended up causing a drive belt failure. I can link that video in the top right of your screen if you haven't seen that one. But on this particular snowblower, if we go down to that same shaft right here, check this out. This has the same amount of play. However, my customer said he didn't have any other issues other than this engine not starting. And you guys can see the fuel tank has already been removed. So I've already started on this repair. You guys can see that I've removed the plastic carburetor covering as well as the fuel tank, which is very simple. There's a couple 8mm bolts holding some plastic on, and then there's 4 10mm bolts that need to be removed in order to remove the fuel tank. But whenever a machine doesn't start, first thing I do is test for spark. If it has spark, then generally it is the carburetor 9 times out of 10, so that's where I start. However, as I'm removing a carburetor off of any machine, I check to make sure that the throttle linkage moves properly. So when that's in the high speed position, your throttle should have maximum tension on it, and you should be able to feel resistance when you push it. And then when you lower the speed down, this should move very easily and it should not return with a lot of spring force, and I'll show you that now. So on this particular snowblower, here is the governor, throttle linkage, and speed adjustment lever here. So it is currently in the off position, or the lowest RPM position. So basically the governor spring right there is not under tension, which means that this, like I said, moves freely and it doesn't return under too much spring tension. It just runs off of this spring here. Whereas if we throttle up the engine, you can see quite a bit happening. When this rotates this way, it pulls a rod that then moves this bracket here, which then puts this spring under tension, and then this spring hooks up to either of these holes to determine your top RPM speed. That's your high RPM setting. So now, because this governor spring is under full tension, again, when we pull that, it pulls back harder on the throttle. So how did I determine that there was an issue with the governor system here? Well, going back to the carburetor, as I said, whenever I'm taking a carburetor off, one of the first things I do before removing the throttle linkage is I make sure that the throttle arm itself moves freely. And what I noticed was that when the idle speed control was set to the slowest position, this moved freely. However, when I set it to the high RPM position, this did not move at all, which led me to believe that something was seized in the governor control. Now, as I said, it was a perfect follow-up to last week's video, and this is a completely different issue. However, one that only happens to these particular machines. So I'm going to put a picture up on screen. You're going to notice that the top arm is bent down and it's actually underneath that little linkage there. So what happened is the entire governor system got completely bound up and jammed up, thus not allowing the throttle linkage to move and causing a no start on this snowblower. Now, the reason this happened is because this plate right here was completely seized. So you can see all kinds of rust here, but essentially what I did was I sprayed this whole area with penetrating oil. And then using a pair of pliers, I grabbed here and I just started to try to move this plate. And essentially what happens was there was just so much rust here that this bracket couldn't rotate, which caused this linkage to pop up. So when my customer was putting this into the slow speed, this thing again wouldn't rotate that way, so it lifted up. This arm here actually bent up, and then when he went to put it into high speed, this thing got jammed underneath it, and kind of what a mess that was you guys saw in the photo there. Now, one of the reasons I believe this happens is because if any snow gets under here and then it melts, there's not a lot of drainage, so there is no holes here for the water to essentially drain out of this little plate that they have. So all of that water sits on top of that plate, and then obviously it's going to corrode and turn to rust, which leads to this bracket getting seized. So once again, using a little bit of penetrating oil, you can pretty much use anything. I was using some PB Blaster here because it worked well enough for what I needed it to do, which is loosen up that bracket there. Now, after letting that bracket sit with that penetrating oil under it, and like I said, using the pliers very gently just to start it to rotate a little bit, I then used the wire wheel on my drill here, and I'm just using that to bust up any of the rust that is formed on top of this bracket and underneath it. So we're trying to clean that up as best we can. Now, with the combination of the penetrating oil and the wire wheel on my drill, I was able to free up that bracket enough to the point where I could move the governor linkage and that bracket would rotate out of the way. So we now have a full range of motion, which will allow me to get the wire wheel into these hard to reach areas. And you guys can see here all the bits of rust that are breaking away, and again, the wire wheel is perfect for that. So I'm going to keep going with the wire wheel, clean this up, and then I'll show you guys a couple tricks to prevent this from happening in the future, and also a trick to prevent your governor spring from coming off, because it is a very common issue on this type of design. Now, once you get that area ground down enough with your wire wheel, check it out. You guys can see it looks completely different now. So all of that rust has been broken away, except for all of the rust underneath that bracket. There really is no way to get at that unless you take this whole plate off. And in order to not remove everything, which you really don't have to, what we're going to do is use a little bit of Permatex nickel anti-seize. So just try to keep in mind where the bracket rotates. You're going to want to get the nickel anti-seize as best you can around all of those areas. And then, like I said, we can rotate the bracket and try to get that brush, see that, underneath that bracket there, to just really allow a little bit of lubrication, even though nickel anti-seize isn't a lubricant. They say it is on the bottle, but you have to remember that this is just preventing things from rusting and seizing, hence why it's called an anti-seize. Once again, moving that bracket, get that worked in, and then I'll get all the areas that I couldn't before. So with the Permatex nickel anti-seize, again, the bracket has full range of motion. And if you guys are wondering about, the anti-seize having an issue because it's on top of the engine, Permatex nickel anti-seize is good for temperatures of up to 2,400 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, I believe, over 1,300 degrees Celsius. So you don't have to worry about this stuff cooking off because the engine's running. I commonly use this stuff on applications that require a high heat anti-seize, such as preventing a muffler bolt from seizing. This stuff is great for that. With that being said, though, I wanted to share one of the little tricks that I like to do, because there is a common issue with these snowblowers, and that is going to be this governor spring completely coming off of the post that it hooks onto there. And it's going to be a simple, easy fix. So what happens is when you go into the low RPM on this particular machine, you can see how the governor spring is starting to loosen up. And I want you to watch that plate there, that little tab that the spring hooks onto. You see how far back it moves? Literally almost to the edge of that spring. Now, one of the issues that I commonly run into is this spring right here sometimes pops off of this little tab there, and then you go to throttle up your engine, and watch this. Now your governor spring is not hooked up. So this is a very common issue that happens to these snowblowers, and I've fixed, I think, like 3 or 4 of them before. And the process for identifying the governor spring coming off is going to be the same that I did for identifying the seized governor bracket. What you're going to do is throttle the engine up to high speed, and then once again, we're going to come back down to the throttle lever here and linkage, and you're going to notice that in the high speed position, this throttle lever should have full tension on it, and you'll notice now that it is incredibly easy to push, whereas before when I was pushing it, this thing was snapping back with quite a bit of force because, again, the governor spring kept tension on it. Now, the way we're going to fix this is quite easy. Grab a hold of the governor spring and hook it onto that little post there, and then you're going to need a pair of needle nose pliers. Then move the speed control lever into the high RPM position so that the governor spring is under tension. And then using a pair of needle nose pliers, you are just going to put a little bend on the end of that spring, just like that. And that will prevent it from coming off of that post that the spring hooks onto when the speed control lever is moved to the low RPM or the shutoff position. So I'll try to show you guys this as best I can. You see when the post moves back now, it physically cannot pop off because that little bend is there. Not sure why they don't do this from the factory, but I'm telling you right now, this little trick is going to save you from having to remove the fuel tank and everything and, do that during a snowstorm maybe. Now, if you haven't done that little spring bending trick, then what I would suggest is you do not use your speed control lever to shut off the engine, because there's going to be 2 separate shutoff switches on this machine. There's going to be one here, so when you put it into the low RPM all the way, like I said, it connects that little ground wire going to your coil, thus stopping spark at the coil. But there's also another red key switch here that you can simply pull out, and that also grounds the coil. So on these particular machines, I always recommend that the customer leave the engine running at either the high RPM or the medium RPM setting. Just go ahead and pull out the key switch until the engine stops and then put it back in. And doing that will ensure that the governor spring there will never become disconnected from the little post that it hooks onto. And then going back to the idler arm shaft play, again, if you haven't watched last week's video, I'll link it in the description as well as the comments down below, where we basically just removed this backing plate by removing a bolt here and on the other side, and we were able to put some washers in between the shaft and this plate to limit that play, preventing a future drive belt failure. Well, that's going to wrap up today's video. It was a fairly simple fix. All we had to do was take the wire wheel to all of that rust, lubricate that governor bracket properly so that it was able to rotate, and the governor linkage is now not binding up, allowing the throttle linkage to rotate freely. With that being said, if you guys enjoyed the video, think about leaving me a thumbs up. It really helps me out. You can click here to subscribe and click over here to watch one of my previous videos. I upload every single week, so be sure to stop on by next week, check channel out for new content. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.